And welcome back to the Rick House. Cyrus Farmer here, Stomp the Tee podcast. We are back with more scintillating content. Now, I got to tell you, we got a lot to do tonight, and I want to get started fairly quickly. Obviously, we're going to be talking about Whiskey 101. That is literally the theme of tonight's episode. We'll be talking and answering any questions you may or may not have about whiskey, its quality, some of the terms you hear thrown around all the time. And of course, as always, we will be going with the ever popular segment of What Are You Drinking Tonight? But first, I want to delve into two topics that happened recently, and I think I should have my voice heard on this. The first topic was, I guess last night, the Liberty won the game against the Minnesota Lynx in the WNBA Finals Championship Series. And there was a big shot by Sabrina Ionescu. Someone, I think on ESPN today, called the shot by Ionescu the greatest shot in New York Liberty basketball's history. I thought that was interesting. I didn't watch the game. I saw the highlights. It certainly was a big-time shot. But I will say this. It made me start thinking about, with the opening of the NBA season coming, I guess, next week, it did make me start thinking, if you were to actually calculate or vote or think about or give your opinion about the biggest shots in the history of any franchise, what would they be? I mean, there's a couple of codicils I think I would have to add to this. Number one, it would have to be a playoff game, if not a championship game series. That's number one. Regular season doesn't count. Number two, you would think that it would have to be a singular moment. For example, the first two things that come to mind for me is, in the history of the Toronto Raptors, there was probably no bigger shot than Kawhi Leonard's shot that bounced 4 times off the rim in the Eastern Conference semifinals against the Sixers at home in Toronto that sent them, I guess, I don't remember if it was to the Eastern Conference Finals. I think it was for the Eastern Conference Finals for the right to play in the NBA Finals. Whenever that was, probably about 8-9 years ago. The other big shot, I think, and I think it's probably undisputable, the biggest shot in the history of the franchise of the Miami Heat was Ray Allen's three-pointer against the Spurs when they played them the year that LeBron, Wade, and oh boy, that's a bad job by me, Chris Bosh were together, and they came back to beat the San Antonio Spurs, Duncan and the San Antonio Spurs with Parker and Ginobili. That big time three that Ray Allen hit, I think it was at the end of Game 6, to send them to a 7th game, which the Miami Heat won, and won their, I guess it was their back-to-back championship after defeating the Oklahoma Thunder. Anyway, that was on my mind. It'd be interesting to kind of think about, I mean, there's so many franchises that have big shots that are littered throughout their history that it's probably very difficult to narrow it down to just one. I mean, the Bulls. I mean, what's the biggest shot in the history of that franchise? Is it Jordan's shot against Brian Russell in Utah in what would be his final game as a Chicago Bull when they won the championship? I mean, what's the biggest shot in the Laker history? I mean, I can't count Jerry West's shot from half court against the Celtics. I think they lost that series. Was it Magic Johnson's junior sky hook against the Boston Celtics? I mean, Shaq and Kobe didn't play in very many close series that they won. So, I mean, there's probably a lot to choose from. What's the biggest shot in the history of the Boston Celtics? It's something I've been thinking about most of this afternoon, and maybe I'll try to put together something for you guys to kind of chew on. All right. The second thing that I wanted to get off my chest before we get to Whiskey 101. This is directed to one person specifically on the planet. And whether or not this person listens to my advice or opinion is immaterial. I just have to say it out loud. The person I'm addressing this to is Coach Nick Sirianni of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I'm not sure how much you guys may or may not have followed what happened at the end of the Philadelphia Eagles Cleveland Browns game, a game that the Eagles, in my opinion, tried to find numerous ways to lose. But Cleveland would not accept the win. So, the Eagles won the game. The coach, for some reason, and he's done this on the road before. He did it in Indianapolis against the Colts a couple years ago after Frank Reich had gotten fired. I think this was actually just last year. After Frank Reich had gotten fired, Frank Reich was one of his mentors, and he started barking at the Colts fans, basically telling them, take that. He did it last year against the Kansas City Chiefs. After losing to the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, the Eagles won a regular season game. An impressive win, no doubt. But he starts giving it to some of the Kansas City fans on his way in to the tunnel after the game. But the different thing last weekend was that apparently there were some Philadelphia Eagle fans who were riding Coach Sirianni the entire game, and loudly. I don't know if it was 1 fan, 3 fans, 5 fans, 12 fans, 2 fans. The number doesn't matter. Apparently, there were some fans who were Eagle fans riding the coach. Now, at the end of this unimpressive win, a win nonetheless, but it was as unimpressive a win as you can get considering the state of the Cleveland Browns. Coach Sirianni decides to step over and give the fans, Eagle fans, a little business, little verbal smack talk before leaving the field to go and do his post-game press conference duties, so on and so forth, which apparently he brought his kids into the post-game presser to kind of act as human shields. My opinion, no one else's. So, there's a couple things I want to say, and I'm addressing these to Coach Sirianni. Coach, I have notes here because I want to get this right. Coach, little friendly piece of advice. You cannot yell at your own fans for any reason. I don't care what they say or how loudly they say it. It is not acceptable. You are the head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. That doesn't work, especially here in Philadelphia. I'm trying to tell you. I'm literally trying to help you. It doesn't matter whether what the fans were saying to you was right or wrong. It doesn't matter whether or not the fans were being fair or unfair. You can't do it because when you react to fans razzing you or riding you or getting on you, all you're doing is encouraging not only opposing fans to get on you, to see if they can get a rise out of you, to see if they can cloud your thinking during the middle of an NFL game, you're encouraging Eagle fans to do the same thing. Eagle fans are literally going to test you from now until the end of the season, possibly, just to see how you react. You can't do it. Can't do it, Coach. It's a losing proposition, I'm telling you. You don't think Brett Brown, who was the coach of the Philadelphia 76ers during the entire process and beyond, this is when the 76ers, for those of you who don't know, lost games on purpose, tanked essentially, my words, not theirs, in order to get several high round draft picks year after year after year, one of which netted them Joel Embiid. So you can argue whether or not it was worth it all. But you don't think that Philadelphia fans rode Brett Brown, head coach of the 76ers, during that entire losing process? You don't think that the fans killed Doc Rivers, who was the head coach of the 76ers before Nick Nurse took over the franchise last year? Doc was a huge target on talk radio here in Philadelphia and in the stands and Wells Fargo Center. Doc heard it all. I'm telling you. He never reacted that way in the actual arena. You can't do it, Nick. Can't do it. It's not worth it. Now, if you don't like hearing from the fans in Philadelphia, and I'm going to be honest, fans in Philadelphia are tough. They can be assholes. That's not a critique. That's just literally an observation. Philadelphia is a tough town. But that's what you sign up for when you coach here. There are 32 of these jobs in your league, the NFL. If you don't like hearing it from the fans, again, whether they're fair or unfair, give it your spot. Let somebody else take your job. Give the clipboard and the whistle to somebody else. Because I'm telling you, this is a losing proposition. Now, is it possible for Coach Sirianni to recover? Well, we have an example from earlier this year. Interestingly enough, the Philadelphia Phillies third baseman, Alec Bohm, essentially was caught on camera mouthing something like, "I hate this city," or "I hate this place," because early in the season, the baseball season this year, because the fans were riding him because of poor production. Now, the fans got on him even more, and it was a huge media story here in the Philadelphia area. Bohm, to his credit, picked up his production, and the fans largely forgot that incident that happened very early in the season. Bohm apologized. He said he's got to be better, he's got to play better, so on and so forth. All the things you want to hear from an athlete who stepped in it, basically. So good on him. And he picked up his production, and the fans got off him throughout the rest of the season. But that is, to me, the only way Coach Sirianni gets out of this mess that he has created for himself and possibly his team. Now, there are some people who think that his team is going to rally, and the Eagles are actually going to get behind their coach and play better football. That would be great. Any Eagle fan around, whether they like Sirianni or not, will not root for a poor outcome in an Eagles game. If it comes down to winning or losing, you want the Eagles to win. You're a fan, right? So that would be great. But the Eagles have to win in much more impressive fashion. You can't be squeaking by bad teams. You have to win games like you're actually a Super Bowl contender. Now, one last little piece of advice, Coach Sirianni. If you think things are hot now, lose to the Giants on Sunday. I'm telling you, don't do it. Have your team prepared. Make sure that you put forward your best foot. Win the game. And don't, under any circumstance, talk to anyone that is not on the sidelines. Leave anyone in the stands alone. Leave players on the field, unless they're your players, alone. Don't talk to anybody, because if you lose this game to the Giants, I'm telling you, you thought it's hot. Now, it's about to get really hot. All right. So, on to the show. Whiskey 101. Look, I'm really looking forward to getting into this. But before we get started, I do want to say two things. One, don't forget to like, subscribe, do all the things you would do to support any podcast. Stomp the Tee. All right. And we are here for you. And we're going to be trying to bring you the best content possible week in and week out, which is why we're here tonight. The website, stompthetee.com, is a disaster at this point. We're working on getting that up and running. And trust me, it will be available between now and the end of the year. But just give me a little bit of grace. We're trying to get this plane literally constructed while we are in the air. But to me, the most important thing to give you is content. We can worry about the garage of where that content is housed later. All right. Secondly, I would also like to say this show is for anyone, male, female, black, white, young, old, who enjoys the things that we enjoy, or who are interested in the things that we may be interested in. Golf, bourbon, the good life, leisurely pursuits. We have something for everyone. So don't worry about, oh, I'm a 32-year-old guy who doesn't play golf and I only drink beer. Who cares, right? If you like what we're talking about, watch, listen. Don't worry about if you're a 54-year-old woman who's like, I love whiskey, but I don't play golf. Who cares? Listen to what we have to say. I think you can get a lot out of it. So, with that, Whiskey 101. Now, something to remember about whiskey. In its most basic rendering, whiskey is made of 3 ingredients: grain, yeast, and water. That is it. I mean, that's as simple a recipe as you can ever have for any product that you are actually making. Now, whiskey's distinct flavor comes from the wood, which is the barrel that it's aged in. That's not really an ingredient. That's more of a beneficial, let's say, polluting factor in the aging container. Why do we call it a polluting factor? Because what happens is the water, the liquid, the essentially moonshine that goes into the barrel gets not only flavored by the barrel, but colored by the barrel. So what is white or clear turns brown, amber, golden, simply because that whiskey in its white dog form, it's called white dog sometimes it's called moonshine, leaches the color from the actual wood in the barrels. Now, by legal definition, this is per the U.S. Tax and Trade Bureau, a spirit must be distilled from a fermented mash of grains at less than 95% ABV, which is 190 proof. I'm going to go into this difference between the ABV and proof in just a moment. And bottled at no less than 40 ABV, which is 80 proof, and have the taste, aroma, and characteristics generally attributed to whiskey in order to be called American whiskey. There are legal parameters for the labeling of the liquid we call whiskey. There are legal parameters for the labeling of the liquid we call bourbon. It is actually much more regulated than one would think, which is actually a good thing, especially when you know the history of alcohol in this country. Now, ABV, what does that stand for? ABV stands for alcohol by volume. Now, it's a measure of alcoholic strength. The amount of ethanol, which is alcohol, in a container is shown as a percentage of the overall volume of the bottle's contents. So, if you have a bottle of bourbon, if the bourbon has a number of 40%, if the label says it's 40% ABV, that means it is literally 40% of all the liquid in that bottle is alcoholic, right? That's ethanol. So that's what ABV is. What is proof? Proof is simply the doubling of any alcohol's ABV. So if something is 40% ABV, then that means that bottle of liquor is 80 proof. Why do we use proof? Proof is what is used often in for taxation purposes. So that's where proof comes in versus ABV. In order to get the proof, you have to know the ABV. And that's what the taxes on the whiskey are based on. It's proof. So, any American whiskey can call itself bourbon. So what's the difference between whiskey and bourbon? I'm about to tell you. Any American whiskey can call itself bourbon as long as the mash bill, we'll get into what a mash bill is in just a moment, is at least 51% corn. It has been aged in newly charred oak barrels, distilled at no higher than 80% ABV, which is 160 proof, and barreled at no higher than 62.5% ABV. It's 100 and, what is that, 62, it's 125 proof. Right? And bottled at no less than 80 ABV, which, of course, is 80 proof. By law, it is illegal in America to add additional flavorings or colorings to any whiskey, which means that the barrel does all the work with bourbon and whiskey in America. So let me break that down a little bit for you. I gave you a lot of numbers. I threw out a lot of figures for you, but this is the takeaway. A mash bill is literally just a list of ingredients. There are grains. Now, we remember what we said. Whiskey is made up of 3 ingredients: grain, yeast, and water, right? So, what are the grains? That's the mash bill. Grains are made up of literally, grains are ground into what's called a mash and then mixed with water and yeast, and that's what helps produce the alcohol. Now, there are 4 grains generally used in whiskey. It's either corn, wheat, rye, or barley, malted or unmalted. So that's literally what a mash bill is. It's the list of grains that are mashed up and used to make the whiskey. So, Elijah Craig, a name you may or may not know. There's a bourbon named after him, but he was a Baptist preacher. He is credited with being the first to have aged his corn whiskey, which is essentially bourbon, in charred barrels. And this happened back in 1789. That's how American, that's how old this drink that we have is. American whiskey, bourbon. It is literally quintessential to this country's birth, essentially. So that's part of the reason I love it. Now, back in the day, aging in some ways was unavoidable. Got to remember, no cars, no trains, no airplanes, right? So if you wanted to get your whiskey to market, and whiskey was created in a lot of places, but from early on, Kentucky started creating whiskey. And what they would do is put their whiskey in barrels. Those barrels would be put on covered wagons and trekked from Kentucky to other places in the U.S., which was relatively small back then. Remember, U.S. was like from the Mississippi east, essentially. So that trek from Kentucky to New York or Baltimore or D.C. or Georgia or wherever, it took some time. So the whiskey would slosh around in these covered wagons, in these barrels, and essentially aged itself. By the time it got to market, it would actually have a little age on it, which is interesting. By the way, I just want to say I'm out of ice, so I had to take this foot-size glass of ice in my whiskey tonight. I normally drink it with literally 1 or 2 small cubes, and then go neat for the rest of the night. But I'm trying to get this 5-foot block of ice to melt. So there it is. All right, where was I? According to the Kentucky Distillers Association, 98% of all bourbon is made by the 68 distillers in Kentucky. Think about that. 98% of all bourbon in this country is made by 68 distillers in Kentucky. Now, there are twice, this you got to bring out at your next cocktail party, because this is a fact, again, according to the Kentucky Distillers Association. There are nearly twice as many barrels currently aging bourbon in Kentucky, which is around 8 million plus barrels, as there are people living in the state. Unbelievable. That is a lot of bourbon. Okay, so by law, Kentucky bourbon must have been produced within the state of Kentucky, although the grain, the source of the grain, could be grown elsewhere. So if you want to make Kentucky bourbon, get grain from Indiana. You want to make Kentucky bourbon, get grain from Ireland. You can do that as long as it is distilled and produced in Kentucky. Now, another popular term that you hear a lot, depending on how much you are into this kind of stuff, is the term bottled in bond. What does that mean? Bottled in bond dates back to the year 1897, when whiskey was completely unregulated. I'm telling you, people were selling whiskey, bourbon, all kinds of alcohol that in some ways were harmful to human health, because in a lot of ways it's like the internet now. It was completely unregulated. I mean, there was just all kinds of stuff on the market that you could buy that may not actually be good for you. So in 1897, Colonel E.H. Taylor, those of you who drink whiskey and bourbon have known that name. That obviously it's another whiskey named after an important seminal figure. Colonel E.H. Taylor worked with the Treasury Secretary John G. Carlisle, I believe this was in the McKinley administration, to have Congress pass, now get this, America's first consumer protection law. Think about it. Bottled in bond, 1897, was America's first consumer protection law. Break that out at your next cocktail party. It'll be very impressive. So, what is bottled in bond? A spirit could place this designation on its label if it was distilled by a single distillery in a single season and stored and aged in a bonded warehouse. Bottled in bond, bonded warehouse. There was also a stipulation that the whiskey or bourbon had to be exactly at 100 proof, 50% ABV. I'll tell you why in a moment. Now, distiller seasons, those are literally, you cut the calendar in half. What is called the spring distilling season is from January 1st to June 30th. What is called the fall distilling season is July 1st to December 31st. So those are the two seasons. So all the whiskey to be bottled in bond has to be produced in a bonded warehouse by the same producer in the same season, whether it's fall or spring. and it can't be over 100 proof. The whiskey must be aged at least 4 years in a wood container, i.e. barrel. Now, what kind of barrels do we use in America? We use American white oak barrels that have to be charred. That's where you get your flavor. That's where you get the color of the whiskey from. Now, the whiskey, it must be unaltered from its original condition or character by the addition, and this is important, by the addition or subtraction of any substance other than by filtration or other physical treatments. What does that mean? It means that whatever you put into the barrel, you can't doctor when you take it out of the barrel. You can't add caramel, which some cognacs do, or armagnacs. You can't, take out anything other than wood chips or sediment when you're filtering. Whatever goes into the barrel has to be bottled pure, essentially. You're not allowed to make additives. That's why bourbon and whiskey, they're so quintessentially American. And that is what you want. And that's what you think about anytime you open up a bottle, anytime you pour it into a glass. This is the quintessential, it's apple pie in a glass. It's as American as it gets. Very unique. Same doesn't happen for Scotch. Same doesn't happen for Irish whiskey necessarily. So, to continue. Now, we talked about 100 proof. It must be bottled at exactly 100 proof. Why? Here's the reason why. The requirement for being bottled at 100 proof is simply a tax purpose. 100 proof is the equivalent of 1 proof per gallon. And that is what taxes are measured. Taxes are measured by that amount. So it makes it easier, if it's 100 proof, it makes it easier for the tax assessors to place the level of tax on the whiskey that has been bottled. So, it is what it is. The label must identify the distillery that made the whiskey, the bottling location. If the bottling location is different from the distillery, it must be stated on the label, so on and so forth. Sometimes that stuff is followed strictly, sometimes it's not. But bottling and bond basically ensures that what you have in the bottle is quality. Now, does every whiskey you drink that is not bottled and bond mean that it's a bad whiskey? No. It's just that there's an extra several steps of care and requirement that are done to produce that whiskey or bourbon that you are drinking. And you should appreciate that. Now, there are something else I want to get into, actually. Whiskey. You may or may not have noticed that whiskey sometimes is spelled W-H-I-S-K-E-Y. Whiskey. Well, that's generally an American spelling. The U.S. and the Irish use the E in their spelling of whiskey, with the notable exceptions of American Maker's Mark and Dickel, who both spell the term or the word whiskey without an E. Whiskey without an E, W-H-I-S-K-Y, is how whiskey is spelt in England, Scotland. Think about Scotch. That is by Scottish law, by the way. In Scotland, you cannot spell whiskey with an E and still be called Scotch. It has to be spelled W-H-I-S-K-Y. And you find that in other English territories like Canada, India, Australia, South Africa, as well as in Japan. because Japan got the vast majority of their whiskey making knowledge from Scotland. We'll get into that at some point in another episode, but the father of Japanese whiskey was a fascinating man. Anyway, so there you have it. Whiskey 101. Now look, we are going to be getting into all sorts of little educational segments like this with whiskey, educational segments like this with golf, educational segments like this possibly with timepieces. Some people refer to them as watches, so on and so forth. But that's what we do here, all right? So that is Whiskey 101 for tonight. We're going to stop there. We'll do more later. Now, I do have a question for you. What are you drinking tonight? Well, while I'm trying to navigate this iceberg in my glass, I'm going to tell you what I'm drinking. And this is one of my favorite all-time go-to bourbons. You literally can't go wrong with this bourbon. What am I drinking? Wild Turkey Rare Breed. Guys, I'm telling you, the Rare Breed, it's barrel proof. I'm going to give you some numbers. It is as drinkable. If you have a neighbor who is thinking about getting into bourbon, and they're like, oh, where should I start? What should I buy? I've heard, Eagle Rare. I've heard this, that, and the other. I'm telling you, introduce them. Give them a bottle of Wild Turkey Rare Breed. It is about as good as it can get because there's a couple different reasons for that. Wild Turkey Rare Breed, it's very drinkable. Now, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of stats on what's the nose, what is the what's the flavor. Is that cherry or is that balsa wood? I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of that. I'm going to tell you if it's drinkable or if it's not drinkable. I'll tell you if it's smooth or if it's spicy or if it's undrinkable. I'll tell you if it's drinkable straight. I'll tell you if it's drinkable better in a cocktail. That's how I'm going to give you my opinion. Wild Turkey Rare Breed is about as good as you can get for a couple of different reasons. It's drinkable, very drinkable, great flavor, smooth, no issues, and it is incredibly available. It is not hard to find. It's not Elmer T. Lee. It's not one of these, I remember 15 years ago, you could get Blanton's anywhere. And now you basically have to rob a bank to get a bottle. It's unbelievable. It's accessible. You can find it in any liquor store. And it is $50 a bottle. Affordable. It's not going to break the bank. It's not going to kill you. You can have it practically every day if you want. It can be your everyday go-to non-special occasion drink after work. Rare Breed. Now, here's some numbers. It's 58.4% ABV. What does that equate to? I look at the label. 116.8 proof. What is that? It's a high proof. 54.8 ABV. It's a lot of alcohol. But I'm going to tell you right now, you don't have to be like me. But I generally tend to lean towards, not exclusively, but generally, I lean towards higher proof bourbons and whiskey. Why? This is a bias on my part. I'll be the first one to admit it. I feel like anyone can make an 80 proof, a 90 proof, a 92 proof bourbon drinkable. It's practically Kool-Aid. You know what I mean? I can add water, I can smooth it out, I can do whatever I want. Craftsmanship, in my opinion, is when you can make a higher proof, 100 proof or higher, drinkable, smooth, delicate. That's what I tend to gravitate towards because I can always proof it down myself by by adding an iceberg in my glass or just a few drops of branch water. So, more stats. I told you it was 54.8% ABV. I told you it's $50 a bottle. Wild Turkey Distilling Company, that's who makes it. They get their stuff. They're distilled in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. Now, interestingly enough, almost all of Wild Turkey's products, whether it's Rare Breed, their rye, their Wild Turkey 101, whatever, they use a number 4 char in their barrel. What does that mean? It means that the barrel, the inside of the barrel was charred, burned, for up to 60 seconds. There are like all sorts of, there's 4 ranges of char that you can have in a barrel. There's char number 1, char number 2, char number 3, char number 4. 4 is the most extreme, and that's only 60 seconds, right? It's essentially called an alligator char. And they believe that it imparts more flavor and more character to their bourbon. Now, the water for all Wild Turkey products comes from the Kentucky River. Wild Turkey still uses its original yeast strain, which has been used for over 60 years. Interesting. Now, Wild Turkey is one of the few distillers that have never used a genetically modified grain, GMO, in any of their bourbons. Interesting fact. I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but it's interesting. Wild Turkey exclusively uses a number 4 char, as we said before. Sometimes it's called an alligator char because the bark breaks up. On all its barrels, which their bourbon and rye are aged. They say it gives their products a distinctive Wild Turkey flavor. So that's why they use that number 4 char on all their products, bourbon and rye. So there's a some similarity, a commonality with their products that they produce, regardless of the proof. It still tastes like something from Wild Turkey. Allegedly, the mash bill. What is a mash bill? Again, it's the grains that were crushed up to create the alcohol. The mash bill for this Wild Turkey Rare Breed is 75% corn, 13% rye, 12% malted barley. Now, allegedly, Wild Turkey uses the same mash bill for all of their bourbons. It just comes out differently depending on how long they age it, so on and so forth. The age statement here is 6. It's a blend for this rare breed. This rare breed allegedly is a blend of 6, 8, and 12-year bourbons that have come from different barrels from Wild Turkey. And they blend them all together at the right percentage to create what's in this bottle. That is Wild Turkey Rare Breed. Folks, as always, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, do all the things you would do to support any podcast you enjoy. Cyrus Farmer here once again. That is the end of tonight's show. Stomp the Tee. I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And as always, we will see you on the first tee.